Welcome, Hillmantok students, to Class 6 of Intro to AAVE. Today we're going to be jumping into sociolinguistic aspects of AAVE. We're going to be focusing on two critical areas, the linguistic aspects towards AAVE and the phenomenon of code switching. I'm going to apologize in advance. I am very nasally. That's why one of the reasons the class is so late, just because my allergies were killing me. I'm not ready to be in New York. I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to just look over the definitions for the course. As you've seen in other classes, it's just going to level the ground that we all start on as we proceed through the coursework. This is our lesson map or our objectives for today's class. We're going to be examining the origins and persistence of linguistic attitudes towards AAVE. We're going to discuss the impact of these attitudes on AAVE speakers' social and educational experiences, defining code switching, and exploring its significance in the lives of AAVE speakers. And finally, we're going to analyze a few case studies and research findings related to linguistic attitudes and to code switching. So from our definitions page, we know that social linguistics is the examination of the interplay between language and society, and exploring how social factors influence language use and how language in turn affects social interactions. By studying linguistic attitudes and code switching in the context of AAVE, we're going to gain insight into the broader societal dynamics that African American communities and other AAVE speakers use. The linguistic attitudes refer to the belief and opinions of the people who hold the beliefs that people hold about different language varieties. So for AAVE, we see how it's historically stigmatized and viewed as inferior or uneducated speech. These negative perceptions have led to linguistic discrimination, which affects the speaker's opportunities for education, for unemployment, for social mobility. And understanding that how these attitudes impact is crucial for addressing the biases and then promoting linguistic equity. And code switching is going to be the alternative or flipping between two or more language varieties within a conversation or a discourse. So, for instance, for AAVE speakers, this code switching would be between AAVE and Standard American English, depending on the social context. The code switching serves various functions. One way is to navigate different cultural identities, another is conforming to societal expectations, and finally achieving maybe a specific communicative goal. We're going to explore this a little deeper as we get further into this class today. But I just want to leave with you the adaptability and linguistic versatility that AAVE speakers have, because language is power, so we have to understand that how we speak, the way we speak, shapes how we are perceived and treated in society. Linguistic bias is real, and consequences from that are also real. They result in barriers to education and employment and even in the legal setting. Code switching is more than just a choice. Many AAVE speakers feel almost pressured to shift their speech to avoid discrimination. But it has benefits and costs, and so at the end of today's lesson, I hope you have gained a deeper understanding and appreciation for how complex that can be and the sociolinguistic challenges that AAVE speakers face. More importantly, I do encourage you to think critically about how society's attitudes towards language reinforce larger systems of privilege and inequality. I asked you guys, to get started with this conversation, just watch this brief trailer from the documentary Talking Black in America, and it highlights some of the key themes that we'll explore today. So you're going to take a pause here and look at that. If you have any initial thoughts on experiences with code switching and linguistic bias, I'd like you to share that if you feel comfortable, either in the TikTok comments or in the YouTube comments. On my website, adventuresinzen.com, I'll have the link to the full video on YouTube as well as other resources. When we look at the attitude that many people assume that AAVE speakers just don't know how to speak standard American English or are choosing not to out of sheer resistance, they're not understanding that AAVE speakers are, kind of conditioned to be biodialectic, and they switch back and forth as needed. A lot of times because, as we stated under the Oakland Ebonics controversy, it is their almost native tongue, their home language. It is what they feel most comfortable with. It is part linked to their culture. And so we speak the way we speak because of that. It's a lot deeper than anybody would have an attachment to standard American English because of the nature of what it was born from. So when you look historically at how AAVE is portrayed in ways that create these negative and reinforce these negative stereotypes, you see Black characters in movies or TV. They often speak AVE only in comedic or uneducated roles. And so those negative perceptions persist. And then from there, linguistic racism rises up and starts to discriminate people for how they speak. And they'll frequently experience this in education, in employment, and in everyday interactions. And we've been talking about this consistently throughout the course. From sounding Black, you'll receive fewer callbacks. From sounding Black, you'll lose ground in professional spaces. And, in classrooms, you may not get called on, or if you are, you're ridiculed. And so employees, students, whoever feel the pressure to code switch to avoid this discrimination. And so, as the video touched on, the 1996 Ebonics controversy was a national debate. It erupted after the Oakland Unified School District in California passed a resolution to recognize Ebonics, now known AAVE, as the primary language of many Black students. And so it was December 18th, 1996, and they used the term or the phrase that they wanted to formally recognize Ebonics as the genetically based and not a dialect of English. And this wording, I feel like, is what drew so much criticism because people took it two ways. One, they saw it as the Oakland School Board saying that Black people were inherently predisposed to speaking about Ebonics and that they wanted to replace standard American English. Neither of those were true. The phrase was not intended to mean that Ebonics was going to be the primary language or the only language. It was just trying to separate it from English and highlight that it has origins in African language, all of which had been widely accepted at the time by linguists. So the resolution aimed to improve educational outcomes for the African American students by acknowledging this distinct linguistic system and then understanding that they would have to work to build a toolkit to bridge these two languages dialects together, standard American English and AAVE. But the public was overwhelmingly negative in their reaction, a lot of it fueled by misunderstanding. Then it became the political backlash, and as always, the racial tensions and undertones. And Oakland had a large African American student population at the time, was about 53%. Data has shown that these students were underperforming in literacy and language assessments compared to their white peers or, non-people of color. Many of the African American students had a linguistic mismatch, where they were speaking AV at home and then forced to speak standard American English at the school. And this caused them to be disproportionately placed in special education programs due to these language-related misunderstandings. One of the proponents against the Oakland School Board resolution was Reverend Jesse Jackson, who initially called the policy an unacceptable surrender that would cause, teachers to teach down to Black students instead of holding them accountable to the higher academic standard. And the U.S. Secretary of Education, Richard Riley, opposed the idea of funding programs based on Ebonics, stating that standard American English should be the only focus. And, the media just jumped right on that bandwagon, started mocking Ebonics, calling it ghetto slang. Late night hosts, it was always in their jokes. They went to it almost like as much as they go to Whoopi being ugly, which we all know is not true. And so their racism was coming very much to the forefront on that. Nevertheless, linguists such as John Rickford, Geneva Smitherin, they considered to, John Baugh, they considered to defend the policy, emphasizing that AAV is a systematic dialect that should be understood in education. And so, after some people learned more about the intent, people like Jesse Jackson did soften their stance, stating that they recognized that Black students' home language could help them learn better. Educators and researchers already had plenty of research showing that bilingual educational models, where students' first language are used to support their second language acquisition, is very successful. So this is not something that they're unfamiliar with. They just did not want to apply it to AAVE for a numerous amount of reasons that we could get into, but they all end with the same ism. So we move forward, stating that, if you do not understand this separate linguistic system, you are going to lead to lower expectations, misdiagnosed learning disabilities, and unfair grading. And these negative attitudes persisted in and outside of the classroom because they're based on social and racial biases. So people were very dismissive back then of AAVE, and they expressed their subconscious and very conscious, sometimes prejudice against the speakers without any real valid linguistic critique. So, the research continued to work towards where we are now in a more accepting Black cultural expression and communication world. However, it's still not universally accepted. Janita Smitherman said, the negative attitude towards Black speech are rooted in racism, not in linguistics. And despite how long ago this controversy was, it still has not abated some of the misunderstandings that persist. And while some school districts quietly adopted a controversial analyst program, uh, to help students recognize the difference between Standard American English and AAVE, we're still not where we need to. John Rickford stated that, even though the Oakland Resolution was widely misunderstood, it did start an important national conversation about linguistic prejudice and Black student education. So we can take that as a sort of win that the controversy forced educators to and the public to confront biases about Black speech. In 2000, John Baugh did a linguistic profiling study that found that landlords and employers discriminated based on speech alone. This is before they even saw anybody. So he made phone calls to landlords and employers using different accents. He used Standard American English, he used AAVE and Chicano English, different dialects essentially. And when using AAVE, he was frequently denied apartments or job interviews. The same landlord or employers were more willing to offer opportunities when he spoke Standard American English, even though he wasn't actually changing the content of his words. People's speech patterns trigger biases. It leads to unfair treatment, and so this is a way of them gatekeeping with covert discrimination, where they base their decisions on applicants based on speech alone. We also see it when people discuss their experiences with their names. My name is Shakima Funches. A lot of times people will, understand or hint to that I am a person of color, as opposed to if I was named Rebecca, I might persuade differently in my hiring decisions. So this is something that we always keep in the forefront of our mind when interacting, because hiring decisions are made at very initial points of contact with these oral cues, accent, pronunciation, intonation, name, and stuff like that, determine whether a candidate advances. And so in 1999, he had previously done his house study, and the results were similar, that housing options to AV speakers were not as welcomed as those with Standard American English speakers, where calls were identical in content. It is a way for them to reinforce residential segregation, where Black renters of color, are systematically excluded from predominantly white neighborhoods. And just as, historically redlining policies segregated Black communities, linguistic profiling and prejudice can also serve as a modern day mechanism of exclusion. Housing discrimination also contributes to racial wealth gaps, as ownership in the United States is primarily a way to accumulate wealth. And so there are and have been changes, including fair housing laws that prohibit racial discrimination, but it is a lot harder to prove linguistic profiling. And so it's a legal gray area that's often unchallenged in courts. And that's something that we would have to move towards to changing. On the educational front, on the educational standpoint, you know, we already discussed how the AAV mistakes lead to unfair grading, and there's a pressure to conform to Standard American English, where students can, try to feel or begin to feel like their language at home is wrong or inferior, and that will then affect their confidence and participation in class. Research shows that teachers are less likely to call on students who use non-standard English. This was a study done by Lemon 2 in 2016, and this reinforces educational inequalities where they are now having access to less resources because of how they speak. And in contrast, white students who speak non-standard dialects, such as like Appalachian English, they do not see this same linguistic barrier. They instead get accommodations rather than corrections. Many state exams, too, are disadvantaged to dialect speakers because they're written in standard English. And so that linguistic discrimination starts to intersect with disciplinary policies, where students are more likely, especially Black students, are more likely to be suspended or expelled for talking back when they're only talking Black, and this cultural specific discourse style is seen as disrespectful or immature. And then this could facilitate the school to prison pipeline, because it exposes this underlying racism that kids pick onto very, very early. They don't expect much from me, so I'm not going to give much. And these people ain't on my side. And then they start to close off and go down different avenues than they could have if they had been, encouraged and reinforced and, just poured into. And we see it all the time. And that's why one way, a lot of the music and arts, a way to kind of bridge that gap, these are really great courses and classes that bring kids out of their shell and expose them and teach them in a cognitive analysis pedagogy of how to express themselves with both Standard American English and AAVE. But these are, programs that are just constantly cut. And so Without the correct course correction, we're going to devalue both. Um, so that's why professional development for teachers is very needed on linguistic diversity. It has been known to combat bias. If you look at the 2013 Trayvon Martin trial, Rachel Dutton was a key witness and a friend of Trayvon. She spoke fluent AAVE in court, and many jurors and media outlets found it difficult to understand. John Rickford did a Stanford linguistic analysis of the case and argued that racial and linguistic biases hurt her credibility. The ability for the juries to understand her dialect influenced the trial's outcome potentially because they felt that she was being either dishonest or had less education, and so then they started to resonate more with the course of the court case that was provided in standard American English. And so these are ways that we see that linguistic discrimination impact both education and legal proceedings. And so I just want to touch on that because we are going to talk more about AAVE and the law in the next class. But, you know, looking at how they are essentially dismissing testimony due to linguistic prejudice means that AAVE speakers will face an unfair advantage in the legal system. And it shows that Black defendants can receive harsher sentences or less justice if they refuse to conform to standard American English norms. And, legal professionals have said that, the AV features such as the habitual be can be seen or mistaken for error or evasiveness, leading jurors to misinterpret the testimony. And some scholars have stated that, for AAVE to be treated similarly, it needs to be treated as a second language, well, fairly. It needs to be treated similarly to second language in court, ensuring that defendants and witnesses properly understand each other, and potentially even allowing linguistic experts to testify in cases where dialect bias may impact credibility. Linguistic discrimination overall it operates as a structural barrier in various social institutions, reinforcing racial and social economic inequality. There is the implicit biases that we see in hiring that illustrate how employers frequently associate non-professionalism, lower intelligence, or lack of competence with AAVE. This calls for a need for implementation of linguistic bias training for hiring managers and legal protections against speech-based employment discrimination, similar to the protections that we see already around racial and gender discrimination. Knock on wood, because we all know what's going on in the world and how they're trying to dismantle all of those rights. Conducting match pair audit studies is a way to help expose and challenge discriminatory real estate practices. So that is another option. Continuing the discussion about AAV in education, students who are constantly corrected, as we stated, will disengage from learning, which impacts their performance and their confidence. If we look at the 1979 Ann Arbor Black English case, it was the fourth court ruling that recognized AAV in education, where Martin Luther King Jr. elementary school students took on Ann Arbor School District to set a precedent by recognizing AAVE as a legitimate linguistic system. And the ruling that the school had to address dialect differences and take that into account when educating Black students. And so we look at the fact that this was in the 1970s and that later on in 1996 we're still discussing and trying to challenge the same, um, you know, accommodations for Black students. But anyway, back to Ann Arbor. So it was in the 1970s, and there was a growing Black student population due to the migration patterns from the South and Midwest. And we also talked about that, I think, what was that, 2 or 3 classes ago, about how those regional dialects impacted when we're influenced by the Great Migration. However, back to the Black students at Martin Luther King Jr. School, they were struggling academically, much like the children in Oakland, particularly in reading and writing. And despite there being no cognitive disabilities, these Black students were performing significantly below their grade level, many of them placed in remedial reading programs which have their own already stigmas attached to it, instead of receiving targeted support. Due to that, a group of 11 Black families, represented by attorney Gabriel, I'm going to mess this up, Kamowitz, sued the Ann Arbor School District, arguing that the linguistic bias in the curriculum was harming their children. And so they had initially filed this case in 1977, but it took them 2 years to bring it to trial. And the parents argued that the school was failing to acknowledge AV as a distinct linguistic system, which is a violation of children's right under equal education under federal law. During that time frame, they had linguists come in and testify, such as William LeBove and John Bowe, and they had to explain and illustrate how AAVE follows a predictable grammatic structure. And due to this, standardized tests were biased because they don't accommodate for these dialectical differences. So the school's failure to adapt its teaching methods violated the Equal Opportunity Act of 1974, which mandated that schools have to address language barriers that prevent students from learning. And the school argued that the teachers were simply reinforcing correct grammar, catch it, and that the lawsuit was frivolous. And some school officials even dismissed AAV as slang rather than a structured dialect. And the district attempted to frame the lawsuit as more of a racial issue than a linguistic one. But the attorney, the families, they stood their ground. The case forced the U.S. to confront a question about, something that they had never ruled on before. Does linguistic discrimination count as a violation of civil rights? And so Judge Charles Joyner made a landmark ruling siding with these families, stating that the district had an obligation to train its teachers on AAVE to better support its black students. Now, the court didn't require the schools to teach AAVE, but the ruling was significant in that even though it applied to only Ann Arbor, it set a national precedent of how schools should be approaching dialect diversity. And so in the Ann Arbor School District, they began creating training programs for the teachers on AAVE and linguistic diversity as a whole. Other districts, seeing this changing of the tide, began to rethink how they treated AV students. And so this started a movement that would then later on lead us to the 1996 Oakland Ebonics controversy, where these cases helped shift linguistic roles in legal advocacy as well, showing that language discrimination can be legally challenged even in the terms of AVE. And so we understand that there is still more work to be done. We still need to expand on teacher training and an understanding of linguistic diversity nationwide. But as I said, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, keep pushing on. That you take a look at the Boots Riley film Sorry to Bother You trailer. Well, not trailer, this is a scene from the 2018 movie that offers a cinematic depiction of code switching. In this scene, Cassius Green, played by Lakeith Stanfield, learns to use his white voice from his co-worker Langston, played by Donald Glover. And it serves as a critique of linguistic racism, economic survival, and assimilation in corporate America. The dialogue seen here interplays race, language, and class privilege, showing how white speech patterns are associated with authority, stability, and professionalism, while black speech patterns are marked as less credible or less trustworthy. So I'm going to pause here for you guys to take a look. And when you unpause, you're going to come back to look at a review of how Cassius adopts his white voice, dubbed by, was played by David Cross, and because his sex begins to skyrocket. In that, you see also his body language changes. He becomes more relaxed. He embodies the persona of an effortlessly confident white salesman. And so you'll see exaggeratedly high pitch, nasal, upbeat, and all of this highlights how forced inauthenticity of corporate assimilation greets the customers to a sudden response of positive respect and enthusiasm that they did not have for Cassius before. So when they're not judging him by his accent, he changes his intonation, his pitch, even his emotional inflection. He begins to perform whiteness. Now this performance is one of acerbity. It's not just done for comedic effect. It's trying to underscore the real world linguistic discriminations. So here, whiteness is not just a racial construct, but also a linguistic one, and it's performed and rewarded in spaces of power. So we see, as we already knew, that language is a tool of economic mobility. And so as the film progresses, though, he loses a sense of his identity. The success that he gains at the cost of his self-authenticity begins to influence Cassius, and in adopting that white voice, he becomes a cog in the system. He's expendable, he's replaceable. Anything that made him distinct and unique is now gone, stripped by the corporate machine. And so what Sorry to Bother You challenges is the notion that black success is not purely on merit. They don't care how good you are, your talents. They want to know how well you assimilate. And so the film suggests that in a true post-racial America, true equality is not going to be found in allowing black speakers to emulate or imitate whiteness to be better, but instead to dismantle the biases that bring that whiteness to the standard, to the forefront, for something to aspire to. And so it illustrates that language is not just about communication, it is about power. Language influences who is heard, who is respected, and who is allowed to succeed. So because of that, we get to why do people code switch? Why do they need to adapt to formal and informal situations? Well, to avoid discrimination, to gain opportunities, to connect with different communities. These are all valid reasons for it. But adjusting speech in job interviews or at work can be taxing. Because speaking AV with the family and friends, when you look at Barack Obama and his speeches, he would change back and forth depending on the audience. And so the code switching in different settings, it causes mixed responses because standard American English is given more polish and pronunciation, while AAV has rhythms and expressions that are just different. And so one of the things or the hard parts about code switching, and a lot of people just naturally gravitated, is to try doing it without losing credibility. So in essence, it's a natural linguistic skill, not just for AV speakers, but for anybody. If you see anybody who speaks multiple dialects, multilingual speakers switch back and forth between like English and Spanish, or regional, like northern or more southern drawl. A lot of times you'll see actors. A lot of people say, "Oh, I didn't know that they were British," because they flip out of their American and British accents so well. And so when we look at linguistic discrimination, though, and how it's tied to social survival, it is very important about how they navigate these power dynamics in society. And W.B. Du Bois coined this double consciousness that many Black Americans feel when they have to navigate between their two identities. One that fits white mainstream society, and the other one that remains more culturally authentic. And so, with that comes emotional, social, and physiological challenges, or psychological challenges, that they must adhere to. Because, like, sometimes, especially when you're in a space that is not for you, and AAV is being used by others, it changes how you feel in that space, because now you're more heightened. You're feeling like almost like you're on an attack, or that they're watching you, waiting to see what happens. And so that's why we're trying to normalize AAVE, to bring it into these spaces and to preserve AAVE being used by those who speak it. And so we don't want to see, or we shouldn't be seeing, all these white creators using AVE, monetizing it, and then when Black creators do it, it's being held against them. And essentially, I've had multiple people telling me the algorithm hides my feed. Like, people don't even see my videos who follow me, who have their notifications on. A lot of times you'll go to someone's TikTok page that you followed, and somehow you'll miraculously unfollow them. All of these things are very intentional, and we have to cue into these and keep track of it and hold them accountable to it. And hold them accountable to adhering to and ensuring that there is no community disillusion or distance caused by code switching. Because code switching is a useful skill, but it also is a survival mechanism. A lot of times it's not done as a personal choice, especially when you speak to Black professionals who tell you, like I said, just how much pressure and constantly monitoring their speech. It can be exhausting because you're like watching your words like a double-edged sword. And code switching can open doors, but it also can reinforce societal pressures to conform to standard American English. And, as we understand the black tax and the antiquated views around language and respectability, it means that to seem more qualified, to seem more educated, you feel like you have to change your speech. And in essence, you learn then that code switching has to be strategical to avoid discrimination while maintaining your cultural identity. And so you try to protect your mental health by avoiding the pressure to perform in a certain way at work or in these settings in educational spaces. The older I get, the less I feel torn to like prop up this expectation, this alternative identity in professional spaces. Because as a youth, I was teased about sounding or talking white at school and being into this or being into that. And that criticism, as I look back to it, wasn't just about language, but it was a reflection of the deeper societal expectations on both sides, kind of trying to tear at the core. And so William LeBeau, linguist that we've spoken about a few times, he really debunked the myth that AAV is broken or lacks educational rules. And when he was doing his field study research in Black communities in Harlem, New York, he recorded and analyzed conversations between African American speakers. And he used these recordings to challenge the assumption that AAV speakers were deficient in English. And so Smitherin took this even further and argued that AAV is more than just a way of speaking. It carries historic, identity, and cultural pride. And she emphasized that forcing AAVE speakers to abandon their dialect erases part of their heritage. So AAVE, in essence, preserves the elements of African oral tradition, including the call and response pattern, the rhetorical repetition, the tonal semantics, as part of storytelling traditions from a people who, for a long time, weren't allowed to read and write. It was held against us. It is used to explain our emotions, to engage the audience, to motivate Black leaders, artists, activists. They all use AAVE very strategically. You know, if you look at Dr. Martin Luther King's speech and the way he blends standard English with AAV rhythms and cadence to make his message more powerful, more engaging to the Black audience, research has shown that, if you look at biodialectical education programs, like what the Ebonics resolution in Oakland was trying to get at, you see that Black discourse in politics, hip hop, and literature are so influential. And so, we talked about a Boss study already about linguistic profiling and how discrimination without ever even seeing you matters. And we talked about Trayvon's trial and how people interpret what they see based on what they hear. And all of this leads to essentially not what's being said, but how it's being said and how vital that is. In an ideal world, AAV speakers would not have to code switch. Scholars advocate more for code meshing, which is a more blending of the dialects rather than just switching back and forth within them. Um, Smitherin said that, the burden should not always be on Black people to change their speech. Society must change its attitude. And others have argued that workplace, schools should embrace linguistic diversity rather than focusing on this forced assimilation. If we want to achieve linguistic justice, then we have to achieve true racial justice. And while that remains incomplete, we will get neither. So that is why it is important to address linguistic discrimination that happens with systematic policy changes, with educational reform, with public awareness to ensure that all dialects and the people who speak them are treated with equal respect. So I do want to thank you for your time. I know it's a little later than usual, but please, feel free to continue discussion in the comments and talk about, changes that you feel you have to do in the way that you speak or the way that you've been spoken to, and how do we address linguistic bias in professional legal settings. As a final thought, I do want to leave you with another quote by Janita Smitherin. Language is the bridge to culture, power, and identity. To reject AAVE is to reject the people who speak it. As always, please protect your peace, your edges, and stay hydrated.